Chromatic passing notes are such a powerful part of the jazz sound. One of the few times that I had a guitar lesson that really blew my mind and opened up how I thought about music was before I was even interested in learning to play jazz. In that lesson, my teacher showed me a way to use chromatic notes when I was improvising. And that felt like I'd just been given the secret power to use all the wrong notes and still sound great. For bebop-inspired jazz, chromatic phrases and using chromatic notes is a huge part of the style. And as you'll see, it is one of the easiest ways to start getting that sound into your playing. The phrase that he showed me in the lesson was this, which is a chromatic enclosure. And probably you're now asking, what's a chromatic enclosure? When it comes to using chromatic notes in your solos, then there are two sort of main approaches that you can work with. Passing notes, which is a way to have a single chromatic note that resolves to a note in the scale or a chord tone. Or longer chromatic phrases that approach a target note from above and below, which is what we call a chromatic enclosure. Chromatic enclosures are great as short licks that you can combine with the scales and arpeggios in your solo to play lines that have a surprising element and really move forward. They actually have an advantage over just adding chromatic passing notes, but I'll get back to that later in the video. Let's first check out some solid chromatic enclosures that you can easily add to your playing so that you can hear how powerful a tool they actually are for bebop lines. All enclosures have a target note, so the phrase is creating tension and resolves once it hits that target note. This enclosure is using a half step below and works better if you have a diatonic note a whole step above the target note. When I was taught this phrase, then I was told it was actually from Pat Martino, but I don't think I've ever heard him use it in any of his solos.
Yeah, so as I said, I actually don't think I ever heard him use this in a solo, and I'm kind of curious. So if you know an example, please leave a comment on the video, because it would be kind of cool to check it out.
You can create a great line by combining this with an A-7 arpeggio. In general, combining enclosures with arpeggios is a very solid strategy for making lines sound like jazz. You can also use the third of the chord, C, as a target note and play that arpeggio. That will give you this. And I'm sure you can hear how this is a fairly simple way to create some bop lines that really work. Michael Brecker has some great chromatic phrases as well. This is a variation on one that I took from one of his solos. And it is a great way to use a very dissonant note right on beat 1. I'm combining the enclosure with the arpeggio from the third of the chord, and that gives you this. So if people tell you that you can't put chromatic leading notes on the beat, then just play them this example. It is interesting to see that, like this, the enclosure actually only has one chromatic note. But of course, in the end, a bebop line is just about creating a strong melody with some movement in there. You can use this where more of the notes are chromatic. That will work equally well. So if you use the root A as a target note, then you get this. And as you can see, this phrase is really just built around playing the enclosure and then playing the arpeggio. Since you now know the basic recipe, then you can also start to try other things with how you are playing the arpeggios and where you put the enclosure, because there are a lot of great sounding options for this. Let's try to explore using the enclosure a little bit differently in the line. The reason I thought of this topic for a video was actually that I came across the first enclosure that I ever learned in a Sonny Stitt solo, and I thought it was worth showing you how that worked and how you could use it. And this is actually a pretty common line. I've already talked about it in my video on Dog Rainey as well. The enclosure is this. What makes this an appealing melody is actually the interval skip in the middle as much as it is the chromatic leading note under the A. But maybe that's only me. Using this together with an A-7 arpeggio, which is now played as a triplet, could give you something like this. So what is so amazing about enclosures? Melodies that just move in one direction are not as interesting as melodies that change direction. And adding a single passing note rarely changes the direction of the melody, but adding enclosures will. And in that way, enclosures makes your lines a lot more surprising and interesting. Barry Harris has a whole system for chromatic notes, which actually offers some really nice things as well, and kind of deals with this. Let me know if you think a video on that would be interesting. In some lessons, you'll hear that the chromatic notes are supposed to be on the offbeat, and chord tones should be on the downbeat so that the chord is clear. That's actually not true. You are free to put them anywhere that you want to, but you do of course need to make it into a melody that makes sense, and the ones that are on the beat can be a little bit more tricky. But the chromatic notes are really just there to create tension that resolves back into the key, and if you put them on strong beats, then they just become stronger tension. And Parker actually did this quite often. If you look at this part of his solo on Anthropology, there are two very clear examples with a C sharp resolving on a D7 and an F sharp on beat 1 of a B flat major 7. If he uses it, then so can you. So let's go over an example that does exactly that. This enclosure is approaching the target note in half steps from both sides, what is often called a double chromatic approach. And to make the line even more interesting, then let's combine it with a pivot arpeggio. Just to quickly show you what a pivot arpeggio is, let's just take this C major 7 arpeggio. If you play that ascending, it sounds like this. And when you make it a pivot arpeggio, then you play the root, the first note, and then you take the rest down an octave. That gives you this. And that will give you a line like this one. Using small licks as building blocks is a great way to construct really solid bebop lines. You can find many examples of this if you start to analyze solos. And this is something that you want to develop in your own playing, and you want to build a vocabulary of these flexible building blocks that you can put together in your solos. If you want to see how that works, then check out this video on 7 of my favorite 4-note jazz licks.